What's up guys, it's Johnny Candito of Candito Training HQ. In today's video we have a quick Q&A here and it's going to be a fun one. But for the most part it's going to be focused on how I can help with your training. So the first question is, what is your favorite powerlifting PR? Now for myself, it is by far my 625 pound squat. That to me is my favorite lift because the squat is the most important lift in my opinion in the gym in general. And also, due to the TikTok generation, I would say deadlifts have kind of lost their value. Because a lot of people, my best deadlift is 700 pounds in competition. A lot of people don't realize that if you can hit that stiff bar without straps, with judges, you're basically able to deadlift like 740 with these like dirty conditions where you're able to manipulate things. Whereas the squat, you just can't cheat that lift. How do you cue the squat Ascent? Now this, I would say, what you want to focus on, like the actual cues can vary depending on the lifter, of course. It's a very individualized thing. But the main theme is you want to mirror the descent. So you don't want to do anything different other than just following where your balance is already going. So a good cue for myself would be to focus on forefoot pressure, because I would be the type of lifter where in the past I would sit too far back on my heels. Actively push your whole system forward. And then on the way up, you just stay forward, and then that's good enough. So if you are someone with different faults, of course, then there could be different cues. But for the most part, I would focus on balance first, and then I just think about staying under the bar, that you're just staying under the bar in the position that you already set yourself up for. It's almost like an alley-oop, like you toss it up, and then you go down, and then the rest should just be automatic without thinking. Is periodization really necessary for strength? Now, there's actually a fantastic article by Greg Nuckols exactly on this topic where they did a full research review. And the answer is yes. As far as optimizing strength gains, it is. And it's actually very fascinating to look at the exact numbers. So for periodized versus unperiodized and untrained lifters, it's 17% of an increase of your gains. But then when you're actually a trained individual, then it goes to 23%. And then when you compare daily undulating periodization versus linear periodization, it goes all the way up to 28% is the difference. That's something you're absolutely going to want to take as you get more advanced. So it's actually interesting, though, if you look at hypertrophy, the answer is no. And there was a great systematic review that went over exactly this question. Literally, the title of it is exactly your question. And the answer was no. There was no evidence for it. So the practical application of something like that is if you are programming an accessory at one time a week, so let's say you're doing like machine chest press for 3 sets of 8. In that context, I would just keep it at 3 sets of 8 at RP7, week 1, and then just linearly progress because all you're focusing on is hypertrophy. Whereas even if you involve a lift twice a week, so I'd say something like Larson press or feet up bench, if you're doing that twice a week and you're doing 6s on one day and 9s on the other day, I would say at that point you're already starting to emphasize motor control. So then periodization makes sense. So that's why it wouldn't just be 9s, 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 because now you're actually counting on that barbell variation carrying over due to load and not just volume, not just hypertrophy, but actually being a close lift to the competition bench. But that's a good general rule, is the higher the frequency, the more the complexity. And the lower the frequency, the lower the complexity. Any plans on trying Olympic weightlifting? Before I answer this question, let me get to a word from our sponsor, who, by the way, I do genuinely enjoy.
Today's video is sponsored by Established Titles. This is a really funny gift idea for a significant other or for kids or especially elderly parents. Because what this is 1 square foot of land in Edelston, Scotland. And it grants you the certificate, through the certificate with a crest, it grants you the right to call yourself Lord or Lady. So I'm Lord Johnny Candito. And you can also get it already framed, or you can print it out and frame it yourself. But then you can also change on your credit card. You can make yourself, myself, Lord Jonathan Candito. Or they also threw out the suggestion for your dating profile to also be Lord Johnny Candito. I was already in and out of eHarmony, and that was already a mission success without that title. Now, I don't know if adding Lord Johnny Candito would have made me more successful, but you could give it a shot. So obviously, it's just a funny gag idea. But it's actually really well priced. And if you use the landing page, establishedtitles.com/Candito, you get 10% off. And they were already on sale before this. And then this is in addition to that sale. So overall, it's a really great deal right now. Link in the description. And it massively helps support the channel. And also for every purchase, they actually plant a tree. Also, one last point that I didn't mention is on the certificate, they actually say the exact plot number and they say the exact location. And they said for the first 200 people who use my landing page below, we'll actually all be clustered together in the same area. So that's actually kind of cool that we'll all kind of have a real HQ. Because the Candito Training HQ, the HQ part's always been this ethereal idea, as you can tell. You know, there's no real headquarters. Well, now it's in Scotland. So, like I said, massively help support the channel if you click the link in the description. And I'm sure you can find someone who would just love the idea of owning 1 square foot of land. And due to the rate of inflation these days, I think that's about all my generation can expect to own.
So, as far as plans on Olympic weightlifting, I've already gone to an Olympic training center. For those who don't know, is when in college, I went to the only university that's associated with an Olympic training center. There's 4 Olympic training centers and 1 associated with the university, and that's Northern Michigan University. And it just wasn't fun at all. Not only was it not fun, something I've noticed in long term, and I would actually be very curious for Zach Tellander to make a response to this, is I noticed that weightlifters seem less happy. They really don't. Like, even online, I noticed it. Like, even the trend of like Zach's channel when he was weightlifting, it was a constant battle that didn't really seem worth it from the outside perspective. But I'm sure, obviously, weightlifters wouldn't describe it this way, or else I would imagine they wouldn't do it. But even when I was very briefly trying it out, I noticed everybody there just seemed miserable and was like cussing super loud when they missed a lift. It probably has to do with the fact that it's such a skilled movement that you're trying to nail and you never quite nail it. And it's just like, okay, I'd just rather build myself up consistently, predictably, and feel great. So that's why I went with powerlifting. Tips on eliminating junk volume / movements and creating more precise training. What you really want to do is you want to ask yourself, why are you doing this? And then you want to have the end point in mind right when you start it. So for example, on feet up bench, for myself, and definitely for a handful of clients, is I'll have a 12 rep max progression, a 10 rep max progression, and a 5 rep max progression as far as a training lift. And it's not a true max because it's ending before like a week or a week and a half before their actual test on like the competition bench. So it's just a progression within their main progression. Okay, I hit 265 for feet up bench for a set of 10 reps. And then you try to hit 275. And you try to hit 285. And you track it just like any other lift. And once you start doing that, you will automatically remove so much junk volume, because then if you do 4 sets of 8 instead of 3 sets of 8, maybe you notice like, oh, I'm actually lowering the weight by 15 pounds now versus a cycle or 2 before. And then you start to have a real conversation with yourself like, can I actually come back from this fatigue deficit? And then you start to realize, okay, maybe this beat me down so much that it didn't benefit me. So don't program all of your accessories with just the training effect in mind in the short term without having more frequent testing. So that's what I would honestly say is more frequent testing on more lifts can really benefit you. Doing a little bit more of AMRAPs, involving as many reps as possible. It is a very, very useful thing to make sure you're not bullshitting yourself. And that's why I think you see a lot of belt squat users, belt squat enjoyers. They tend to make really good progress, largely because they do those as many reps as possible tests. Whereas a lot of times people who use the leg press, powerlifters who use the leg press, they just kind of do sets of 8 and they don't really ever test it because it never looks cool on a test set. So a lot of those exercises that you don't normally test, push it. See how many reps you can get. Find out that the sets of 8 that you thought were RP7, you could actually hit 24 reps. And then you weren't doing anything the whole time. That happens so often. And then once you finally find out that your RP is bullshit, now you can recalibrate and go to a true RP7 and then make some real progress. To give a specific example that I've programmed, you can do 3 sets of 15 reps on leg extensions to RP7 on week 1. On week 2, do 2 sets to 16 reps with the same weight, and then that 3rd set, hit as many reps as you can to RP9. No particular rep range in mind. And then if that AMRAP goes really well, let's say it goes 19 reps and beyond, then go straight to 3 sets of 15 again with straight sets, but now with significant loading added. If it doesn't go that well on the AMRAPs, let's say you only hit 17 reps on that 3rd set, then you can go to something like 3 sets of 12 with slightly heavier loading, and then bring it back up to 3 sets of 15 by that 4th week. So you're extending 1 week out. And ultimately, that's all we're really looking at when we're programming for hypertrophy on accessories, is the real only changing factor is just how long should this progression go and how quick it should be based on how fast you're actually able to adapt. Performance doesn't actually matter in particular rep ranges other than delaying how much you want to linearly progress it. The cool thing also about this setup is that it functions in the opposite way over time. So what I mean by this is initially if you're doing junk volume, if you do really well in that AMRAP, it means you're definitely doing junk volume. That's the clear message. If you do 4 sets of 8 on some exercise and then you do a 4th set AMRAP on week 2 and you just blow it up to like 20 reps, that means you are absolutely guilty of doing junk volume. However, over time, once you adjust for that, if you do well in the AMRAPs, it'll actually tell you the opposite message, that you are handling the volume well and that perhaps you could add in a set or so. So maybe you are the type of person who could do 5 sets of leg extensions and not actually just be completely fried from doing that, especially if you're a lighter lifter. So that's why it's important to do it in this way to where it's the AMRAPs at the end and it's in a very comparable situation to the week prior. Because if you do something like an AMRAP as the first set and then you're doing myo reps or drop sets afterwards, that's fine as far as reducing junk volume because you are just increasing intensity. The problem is, if then you do every other week you're doing that, it's not really giving you information on those straight sets. And if you're someone who's guilty of junk volume, odds are you need your whole baseline to be shifted up. You need a complete attitude change that comes with those rep tests in the same context as your straight set work. Thoughts on conjugate style programming, Westside conjugate specifically? I hate it. Heels required for high bar? No. The high bar squat is just the same thing as a low bar squat, just a little bit higher, and you'll just be slightly more upright. And the more you think about it that way, the more success you'll have with it. Because the stance width and everything and the groove and the way that you're positioning yourself doesn't have to be that different. It just has to drift just a little bit, and then you can slowly tweak things. Also, how are you asking me if heels are required in the high bar squat? When every video I upload on this channel of me high bar squatting, I'm using flats in the thumbnail. Sometimes you guys ask ridiculous questions. Singles year-round? Absolutely. I'm a big believer in singles year-round. I think you see it constantly with Joey Flex and his athletes. They continue to thrive, and a lot of them do singles year-round. And ultimately, I find it just helps as far as activation goes. I think it's been truly the most significant change in my training that I made when I went from, I would say, like a 1550 total to 1675 total. It really can just remarkably change just how much you can progress to the point where you guys saw my high bar 10 rep max phase, I still have singles even at RP5 to RP6 because it is that important to make sure that you're always touching 85+% year round. It just eliminates so much time that you have to work back up to your old strength. That's why I found before doing singles year round, you'd make progress maybe on a particular rep range, but then you'd have to restart everything because maybe your actual 1 rep max still goes down by like 20, 15 pounds just because you're not conditioned to it. But then it takes a lot of work, even if your potential strength's pretty high, it takes a lot of work just to actually match it, and then you have to exceed it. Whereas with singles year round, you're right away at around your same max, and then you're able to just make pure progress. You're able to just extend right off of where you were at. So I'm a huge fan of it, and as long as it doesn't fatigue you, I actually find it helps for the next set. I could do a single and then do a really psyched up, top set of 5 reps, and that 5 rep set will actually go better due to having an RP6 or RP7 single preceding it. A critical point when it comes to singles year round is that probably at least 25% of my audience falsely believes that CNS fatigue is higher on singles than it is on rep work. That is not true, at least according to Chris Beardsley. So I'll include a link in the description. You can read more about it because it's a fantastic article. Even on the extreme end of the spectrum, actually ultra endurance work generates higher CNS fatigue. And the reason is eventually it puts a bottleneck on the motor recruitment that you're able to see. And that's why ultra high reps, like 100 rep sets, don't generate the same muscular growth that a set of 10 would. Despite the fact that otherwise there would be no limit because you would be able to eventually reach those fast twitch fibers due to the Henneman size principle. So when you're looking at something like a single, there's actually a lot of reason even to believe in practice that this is true. Like think about how many times you've seen someone at a powerlifting meet like Gavin Aiden on his second attempt on a deadlift here at Worlds. He attempted it, missed it, and then he came back and hit even more weight. Now that happens, granted not super often, but the idea of a lifter being able to hit another attempt is fairly common. And it's more common on singles than it is on any other rep range. So try that with a 10 rep max, come back and hit it. Try that with a 30 rep belt squat PR, come back and hit it. You won't be able to, even if you give yourself enough time for your cardiovascular system to calm down and for some of that local muscular fatigue to wash up. Pull-ups, round your back at the top of the rep or maintain thoracic extension through the whole rep. The strongest pull-upper in the world told me to bring my chin forward and through the bar, rather than just pulling up and possibly fading away. I've found this has already helped me, and you would say that this is the more rounded back style. However, for the most part, your T-spine is already rounded forward in its neutral position, and what's really changing here is protraction of the scapula and a little bit of elevation. Now, this is something that you have to take into consideration when it comes to general strength. Sure, you should probably do something like Arnold rows to offset this, to where you're doing some dynamic retraction work so that you're not just protracting your scapula when you're doing upper back movements. And then when it comes down to lat training, you already want to do cables that isolate the lats and align the muscle fibers of the lats with the angle of resistance of the implement. That's already something you're not going to get out of pull-ups alone. So when it comes down to the fact that you're focusing on a strength lift, I think you should make your strength lift, which means maximizing the weight you can do over a given range of motion, assuming you're not using momentum like a kipping pull-up. So with that all being said, I would listen to the strongest pull-upper in the world. And also something that is interesting is that it's actually in their rule book that you have to break the plane vertically when you're doing chin-up competitions, and you have to actually bring your chin forward and break the plane horizontally of the bar. So that's something that's very interesting. I would actually be very curious what my friend Marcellus could lift if he dynamically used his scapula with the intention of having as strong a lockout as possible, because he's the strongest pull-upper I know in America, and he has a very strict bodybuilder style, and his lockout is his weak point. So I think that that would actually help him to lift 5 to 10 kilos more, which I've heard many people say it adds about that much weight to their 1 rep max. Thoughts on spending 2 to 3 years building a muscular base and then switching back to powerlifting if underweight? This is a terrible idea. Don't do this. It's just like with work or education. You need to see if the opportunity cost is exceeding the gain from continuing to do whatever path you're going down. Now, when it comes to gaining weight, that just comes down to caloric surplus. Then when it comes to the negative effects of powerlifting, for someone who is a lighter lifter who's going to gain weight, you have a very low minimum effective dose, so you're not going to spend a ton of time in the gym. You also are having low systemic stress because you're handling lower loads, so you're not going to have fatigue that's going to bleed over into your bodybuilding movements and reduce the effectiveness of your bodybuilding training. So overall, there's no downside to continuing your powerlifting movements at just 1 to 2 times a week, and you can make progress just doing a single and 3 sets of 6 on bench. Why would you intentionally avoid that? There's no reason to do so. I think at this stage, it should just be, what do you want to do? And if you're going to gain weight, you're going to see some amazing progress. And if you want to see amazing progress in powerlifting in your life, you want to be doing it while you're gaining weight. How do I peak for meets when typical methods, decreasing volume, raising intensity, don't work? This is a great question because I know a lot of people have been in this same situation. You are not training hard enough. Hands down, that is the cause. And the reason is, if you're training really hard, you are clearly going to have points where you can strip back and then you will have a strong peak. Otherwise, what it will feel like if you're training and you're fully recovered or very nearly fully recovered for every session every week, it feels like, okay, you're just picking numbers. And then when you decrease volume, you kind of get more anxious because you're just picking weights and maybe the groove feels a little bit weird and you're just kind of counting on the fact that you can hit 100% of your goal max just because you wrote it down. But it doesn't feel like there's any reason to do so. And that happens very often. And what's happening is you're basically going from baseline training to then actually being undertrained, and then you just have a weak peak. A good way to think about this is think about the most ambitious training program you could come up with. Think about all of these different lifts that could contribute to your success. Think about all these lifts that could contribute to your success. So for example, in the squat, I would say, I would love to high bar ass-to-grass squat. I would love to do 3 sets of 8 on the hack squat as a primary accessory. Then I personally would love to do leg extensions, do maybe 2 sets of 15 and then 1 AMRAP at the end. I would also love to do plat squats. And then I could also see myself doing belt squats quite successfully. So you could really come up with a lot of these ideas and go, I would love to add 75 pounds to my belt squat, add 50 pounds to my hack squat. Really come up with a lot of these ideas and then go, okay, maybe I can only pick 2 out of all those. And then you start to peel back the layers, and now you're thinking more like what you have to. Because right now you're probably thinking in terms of a bunch of rules that are just made up. Like, oh, you can't do more than 5 sets of 3 when you're 2 to 3 weeks out. It's like, well, no, you can. You could do 7 sets of 3 on the squat, even 1.5 weeks out. You could do 3 sets of 5 on the deadlift, 11 days out. I've done stuff like that. You could only drop volume 5 days out instead of even 1 week out. Like, really gets outside of your box, and then a lot of things will open up. And ideally for a powerlifting peak, you should feel like shit 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out. It should feel like you're not sure you're even going to get through this. And when you constantly have that battle, that's when you know you're peaking properly, where you're relieved to get through it. You maybe think you might get injured, you don't get injured, and then you ride the train home, and then you're able to reduce fatigue and have a fantastic meet. And that all relies on singles actually going well during that heavy fatigue. Maybe you're not even hitting depth on some of the squats because you feel so much muscular soreness just carrying over and a high level of systemic fatigue. So that's the way to have a good peak, is to where you really have to think about what accessories and not just accessories, also in terms of barbell volume, just what ambitious goals do you have mid-cycle, and get more ambitious with that. Open up your mind. And if you're constantly running into this issue, I think you need a fresh new set of eyes. And a lot of times that is where, even though I'm the type of person to promote coaching yourself very often, I think everybody can do it to a pretty good extent. It still is very beneficial to have someone else's paradigm just thrown on you. And I know I've done that with clients where like they'll just think like, but I just don't respond well to this, or I don't respond well to high reps on the squat. And then you just have them like, no, let's do it first and then see if that's true. And then they get great results and you go like, yeah, you didn't know what you could have done. So that's happened all the time where I thought like I couldn't bench singles year round. And I remember when Sean Noriega was just like, why not? And it was just one of those moments where I'm like, yeah. I don't know. I guess if I gave an answer, it would just be bro science. So you need to have that moment where you realize, oh, you can do a lot more than you think you can do. And some inspiration, as Ashton Ruska talked about on my channel, is he said when he was coming up, he's like, I would just go as heavy as possible for as long as possible and see how long I can maintain that without breaking down. And then eventually he did break down, but he was able to then find that data and then adjust to it. And that approach is so important. Because even though it is kind of a meathead thing to do, you could argue, it's really smart. It's really not, because it really is a matter of finding where is that limit. And until you find that limit, you can't downscale from it. And I think a lot of people have that issue. And that's one of the issues of listening to too many like experts before you do something, is just go in and see what you can do. Why not? Why can't you do 5 different quad accessories in one training cycle? You know, why can't you do 6 sets of 5 instead of the normal 5 sets of 5 everyone's doing, or 3 sets of 5? You know, try 6 sets of 5. See what you get out of that. So that's my answer, is to open your mind. You should very clearly have direction from the fatigue, and you also want to make sure the fatigue is beneficial and not just junk volume, which is what we talked about earlier in this video. To be specific, first, I recommend that you change your training frequency. Second, I recommend that you change your cycle duration, shorten it. Third, I recommend that you change your accessories, like I talked about, and expand it out and increase volume through that expansion. Fourth would then be changing the barbell volume. The reason why I put that last is because that is something that you want to make sure you're careful about to not bury yourself in specificity. Now you'll notice that this list for the most part is the opposite of what I recommend in how to coach yourself. That video I could not recommend any more strongly that everybody watches it. I'll include a link in the description because it covers so many fundamental assumptions. So, with that being said, the reason why it's the opposite is because that's assuming you already have a mostly successful training cycle and then you're making these minor adjustments. If you have an unsuccessful training cycle and you just really don't know where to go, changing your frequency is one of the most fundamental shifts, to where that will change the direction of the week within the week, to where you'll have a different primary day. It'll open up so many slots for those accessories. And ultimately, what tends to happen sometimes with people is you just need to do more abnormal training than you would think to get to an abnormal place of strength. So what I mean by this is I would say most people can squat 500 pounds with moderate training. But then when you start to squat, let's say 550 at 165 or 170 pounds, or if you're trying to squat 600 pounds or more at any body weight, you may have to do things that you just wouldn't imagine. You know, I've had a client, actually we've basically switched over a couple months ago to having him squat 5 days a week, and then we found that sweet spot of 4 days a week. But for a full year, we had him squatting, I had him squatting like 3 days a week, 2 to 3 days a week, and it was just like, just not working. And it was amazing how many things we had to change. And we're like, man, what is it? And it was like, it was working a little bit, but not quite. And it wasn't until we just accepted, like, look, we're going to squat 4 days a week, and that is going to be our format. And we also shorten the cycle duration because that does help prevent premature peaks since you're doing base work on those accessories the first 2 to 3 weeks of a shorter cycle. So that is something that I could not recommend enough. Now, I will get into the specifics of how to pick cycle duration in general and on how to manipulate variables cycle to cycle for everybody, for all cases. What is the rubric and all of that logic. Now, that will be a separate video on its own because that was actually the very next question was that, and it's obviously running a little bit long on this video, and that will be easily a 15-minute video just answering that one question. So the last question is, when is the Candito 7-week program coming out? Soon. It is in the works. I'm actually writing it right now, and I'm going to send it to someone who's going to give it to their team, and it's going to be a thing. And I think you guys are really going to like what I got cooking up. So without further ado, make sure to like the video, support the channel, subscribe if you haven't already, and click that link in the description to become a Lord today. It's a fun gift, and it massively helps support the channel. Thank you guys. Peace.